The air in that place always tasted like iron and stale sweat, a thick, humid weight that settled in your lungs. But the real tension wasn't in the ring, it was in the corner, in the quiet moments after the bell. That's where Harper would stop me. She wouldn't critique my hook. Instead, she'd reach out, her calloused fingers finding my wrists with a terrifying gentleness. "Tape's loose," she'd murmur, voice low under the thrum of the speed bags. It never was. But as her thumbs pressed against my pulse, checking a tightness that had nothing to do with the gauze, the shift was undeniable. To understand why that touch felt like a lightning strike, you have to understand the ground we stood on. This wasn't one of those polished fitness clubs with juice bars and air conditioning. It was a converted garage in the industrial district, tucked between a radiator repair shop and a defunct textile mill. The walls were cinder block, painted appealing institutional green, and the mats smelled permanently of bleach and effort. It was a place where people came to leave things behind: anger, exhaustion, the grinding monotony of a shift that never seemed to end. The lighting was always yellow and buzzing, casting long, hard shadows that hid nothing. I came there straight from the warehouse. 8 hours of lifting crates and scanning barcodes left my body humming with a restless, frantic energy that I couldn't sleep off. My back ached from concrete floors, but my mind was the problem. I needed to hit something until my arms were too heavy to carry the stress of the day. I needed the dull thud of leather against the heavy bag, the stinging rhythm of the jump rope, the absolute singularity of focus that boxing demands. You can't worry about rent or a micromanaging foreman when you're trying to slip a jab. Harper was part of the furniture. She was usually there before me, wrapping her hands with a surgical precision that fascinated me. She worked as a mechanic at a shop 3 blocks over. You could see it in her hands, even scrubbed clean. The lines of her knuckles were etched with permanent grease shadows, a map of her labor. She didn't move like a fighter trying to prove something. She moved like she owned the space inside the ropes. Efficient, calculated. A predator that didn't need to roar to let you know she was dangerous. Watching her shadow box was like watching water find a crack in stone. For the first 6 months, we barely spoke. Our relationship was built entirely on the language of impact. A nod across the locker room, the slap of gloves touching before a round, the grunt of exertion when one of us landed a solid body shot. It was a clean, uncomplicated dynamic. We were sparring partners, nothing more. We trusted each other with our safety, pulling punches just enough to bruise but not break, pushing each other to the edge of lung capacity but never over the cliff. We communicated in angles and velocity, a conversation that didn't require a single spoken word. There's a specific kind of intimacy in that violence, a closeness that people on the outside don't get. You learn how someone breathes before you learn their middle name. You know the exact tell in their shoulder before they throw across. I knew Harper's rhythm better than I knew my own heartbeat sometimes. I knew that when she narrowed her eyes, she was baiting me. I knew that when she exhaled sharply through her nose, she was about to explode into a flurry of combinations. We learned the geography of each other's defenses, mapping out the weaknesses and the strengths with every session. The gym was our sanctuary. The noise was a blanket, the rhythmic thwack, thwack, thwack of the speed bag, the heavy grunts of the heavyweights in the corner, the squeak of boxing shoes on canvas. It drowned out the city outside. It drowned out the loneliness that usually waited for me in my empty apartment. In here, everything made sense. Physics, leverage, momentum. It was a world of simple rules and immediate consequences. We existed in that humidity, 2 bodies orbiting each other in a gravity well of sweat. I thought I had her figured out. I thought I knew exactly where the lines were drawn. She was the mechanic with the heavy right hand. I was the warehouse worker with the decent footwork. We hit things, we sweated, we went home. It was safe. It was predictable. We were just bodies in motion, keeping our guards up and our heads down until the Tuesday night the rhythm broke. The timer screamed, cutting through the haze of my exhaustion, but I didn't stop immediately. I threw 2 more hooks, sloppy and desperate, just to feel the impact shudder all the way up to my shoulder. When I finally let my arms drop, they felt like they were made of lead and static. I was drowning in that specific heavy heat that comes after 8 rounds on the bag, where your lungs feel coated in sandpaper and the only thing that matters is the next breath. I leaned my forehead against the cool vinyl of the heavy bag to steady the room, sweat dripping from the tip of my nose onto the canvas. The gym was loud, hip-hop rattling the bass speakers, the skipping ropes slapping the floor. But inside my head, it was just the rushing sound of my own pulse. I expected Harper to walk past me toward the water fountain. That was the routine. She'd usually offer a chin lift of acknowledgement or maybe toss a towel in my direction if I looked particularly wrecked. But when I turned, blinking the salt out of my eyes, she wasn't walking past. She was stepping into my space, cutting through the invisible barrier of personal territory we'd maintained for months. She didn't say anything at first. She just stood there, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating off her arms, smelling of that distinct mix of engine grease and cedar soap she always carried. The air between us seemed to thicken, charged with a sudden, unexplained voltage. Before I could ask her what she needed, or if I was in her way, she reached out. Her hand, rough and scarred from years of wrestling with transmissions and brake calipers, closed around my left glove. It wasn't a grab, it was a claim. "You're buckling," she said. Her voice was low, pitched perfectly to slide under the gym's noise, directed solely at me. "On the impact. You're losing power in the transfer because your wrist is rolling." I opened my mouth to argue. My form was solid, I knew it was. But the words died in my throat because she wasn't waiting for a debate. With a deliberate, agonizing slowness, her fingers found the tab of my glove. The sound of the Velcro tearing open seemed impossibly loud. A sharp rip that silenced the rest of the room for me. She peeled the leather back, stripping the glove from my hand with an efficiency that felt practiced, even though she'd never done it before. The cool air of the gym hit my steam-softened skin, sending a shiver racing up my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. My hand, wrapped in damp, fraying yellow gauze, looked small and exposed in her grip. I should have pulled away. I should have laughed it off and said I'd fix it myself. But I was frozen, caught in the gravity of her focus. She didn't look at my face. Her eyes were locked on my wrist, dark and calculating, like she was diagnosing a complex engine failure. "See this?" she murmured, her thumb brushing over the metacarpals. "Too much give." I frowned, staring at the wrap. It looked perfectly fine to me, but she began to unwind the end of the gauze anyway. Her touch was a paradox that short-circuited my brain. Her palms were calloused, hard enough to strike a match on, but her fingers moved with a terrifying gentleness. She smoothed the wrinkles in the fabric against my skin, her thumb tracing the line of my tendons with a pressure that was barely there, yet heavy with intent. It felt medical, clinical, and yet entirely illicit. She began to rewrap it, pulling the fabric taut. She wasn't just securing the joint, she was studying it. Every loop of the gauze felt like she was binding me to her, layer by layer. She took her time, far longer than necessary, her breathing syncing with mine in the narrow space between us. I watched the grease stains on her knuckles move against the yellow tape, mesmerized. The tension coiled tight in my chest, a different kind of exhaustion than the boxing. This was the exhaustion of holding back a flood. When she finally tucked the end of the wrap in, she didn't let go immediately. Her hand lingered, cupping my fist, her warmth seeping through the layers of tape into my bones. For a split second, her thumb brushed the sensitive skin on the inside of my wrist, right over my pulse. It skipped. I knew she felt it. "Better," she said, finally looking up. Her gaze hit me like a physical blow, unflinching, dark, and stripped of any pretense. Then she stepped back, the connection snapping like a rubber band, leaving me standing there with one glove off and my heart hammering a rhythm I didn't recognize. I told myself she was just being a perfectionist, obsessed with the mechanics of the sport. But the next night, she found another loose thread, and I let her find it. It didn't take long for the exception to become the rule. What started as a single intervention on a Tuesday night rapidly calcified into the only part of my day that actually mattered. By the second week, the loose tape excuse had become a flimsy, transparent shield that neither of us was willing to lower. It became our cooldown, a necessary deceleration from the high-octane violence of the sparring session to the reality of the world outside. The bell would ring, the other fighters would drift toward the showers or the exits, leaving trails of steam in their wake. But we would stay. We carved out a pocket of silence in the corner of the ring, a private territory marked by the smell of old leather and the ghost of adrenaline. The intimacy of it was staggering. We weren't standing anymore. We sat on the canvas, knee to knee, inhabiting a space so small that the rest of the gym felt miles away. In that proximity, the ambient noise of the heavy bags and the distant clatter of weights dissolved into white noise. The only sound that registered was the immediate rhythmic rasp of the Velcro and the heavy, settling cadence of our own breathing. I could hear the air entering and leaving her lungs, a slow, deliberate rhythm that gradually synced with my own. It was a breath-level intimacy, the kind usually reserved for the dark quiet of a bedroom, playing out under the harsh glare of industrial fluorescent lights. She smelled of the shop, that sharp chemical tang of engine oil and solvent. But underneath that, there was always the clean, woodsy scent of cedar soap. It was a dizzying combination, grit and polish, labor and care. When she leaned in to catch the end of the gauze, the heat radiating from her body felt like standing next to a furnace door that had just been cracked open. It wasn't just warmth, it was energy, a latent power that she was carefully restraining for my sake. The unwrapping process was agonizingly slow. Harper didn't just remove the tape, she dismantled my defenses. She would unwind the yellow cotton loop by loop, her eyes tracking the exposure of my skin as if she were uncovering something rare. As the compression lifted, the blood would rush back into my fingers, a prickling, hot sensation that matched the flush rising in my neck. She held my hand, not like a tool of the trade, but like an artifact. Her thumbs would work the tension out of my palm, pressing into the meat of the thumb muscle, finding the tight knots between the metacarpals. It was technically a massage, a way to prevent cramping, but it felt like she was reading my palm in a language I didn't speak. And then there were the words. In the beginning, we talked about mechanics, torque, leverage, foot placement, but as the ritual solidified, the conversation shifted. Her voice dropped an octave, becoming a low rumble that vibrated in the floorboards between us. She stopped critiquing my mistakes and started validating my power. "You're heavy tonight," she murmured once, her head bent over my wrist, her fingers tracing the prominent vein in my forearm. I felt that cross in my ribs. "You're getting dangerous." Another night, She paused with the wrap half unwound, looking up through her lashes. "You have a mechanic's hands?" she said, her thumb brushing a callus on my knuckle. "Not because of the grease, but because of the way you understand how things break. It's compelling." The word hung there. Compelling. It was a heavy word for a boxing gym. It landed harder than a jab. There was a jarring, beautiful dissonance to it all. 10 minutes prior, we had been trying to take each other's heads off. We had been trading blows, hunting for openings, speaking the language of violence. And now she was treating the very hands that had been hitting her with a reverence that bordered on worship. She was tending to the weapon she had just been fighting. That contrast, the switch from predator to protector, was intoxicating. It broke something in me, cracking the hard shell I'd built up from years of warehouse shifts and lonely nights. I started living for that moment on the canvas. It wasn't just about the hands anymore. The energy was too big for the ring. It was starting to spill over, leaking out of the gym and into the cool, dark air of the parking lot. The heavy steel door of the gym slammed shut behind us, cutting off the rhythmic thudding of gloves and the bass-heavy hip-hop with a finality that rang in my ears. Stepping out of that humidity into the crisp, cool air of the industrial district felt like walking into a different world. The sweat on my neck instantly chilled, a stark reminder that the sanctuary of the ring was temporary. But we didn't go straight to our cars. That became the unwritten second act of our nightly ritual. We lingered in the gravel lot, the asphalt cracked and sprouting weeds, illuminated by a single, flickering sodium vapor streetlight that washed everything in a sickly, cinematic orange. My Honda was parked next to her truck, an old, beat-up Ford that had seen better decades, but ran with a purr that betrayed the expert hands caring for it. We'd lean against the hoods, the metal still holding the faint dying warmth of the day's sun, arms crossed against the night chill, steam rising faintly from our damp hair into the darkness. This was where the armor really came off. Inside, we were fighters, protected by mouthguards and movement. Outside, we were just two women trying to survive the grind, stripped of the adrenaline that kept us upright. We traded war stories from the trenches of our shifts. I'd talk about the quota numbers the warehouse manager was pushing, the way my lower back seized, up around 2 p.m, the mindless repetition of scanning barcodes until my eyes blurred. She'd talk about a customer who didn't understand why you couldn't fix a catastrophic transmission failure with a prayer and a wrench. It wasn't complaining exactly. It was a mutual recognition of the weight we carried. There is a specific solidarity in blue-collar exhaustion, a shared language of aches and pains, and the bone-deep knowledge that you are trading your body's longevity for a paycheck. One night, the conversation drifted into deeper waters. The air was particularly sharp, smelling of coming rain and wet pavement. Harper was picking at a loose strip of rust on her truck's fender, her profile cut sharp against the shadows. She was talking about a vintage engine she was rebuilding, a project that had been on her bench for months. "It's not about force," she said, her voice quiet, almost lost in the distant hum of the highway traffic. "People think mechanics is just wrenching on things until they move. But it's about listening. You have to feel the tolerance. If you force a piston that isn't ready, you ruin the whole block. You have to wait for the metal to tell you it fits." She stopped picking at the rust and turned to me. The orange light caught the sharp angle of her jaw and the softness of her mouth. "I'm good at waiting," she added. The subtext hit me in the chest like a sledgehammer. She wasn't talking about cylinders or gaskets anymore. She was talking about us. She was talking about the slow, agonizing pace of whatever this was, this dance of wrapped hands and lingering glances. She was telling me she wouldn't push, that she would wait until I fit. The silence that followed was heavy, magnetic, We were standing close enough that if I shifted my weight 6 inches, our shoulders would brush. I could feel the pull of her, a physical gravity that made my knees weak. I wanted to close the gap. I wanted to lean across that invisible line, but I was paralyzed by the implications. Instead, Harper moved. She reached out, her hand hovering in the space between us for a heart-stopping second. I held my breath, but she didn't touch my skin. She reached for the collar of my hoodie, her knuckles grazing the fabric as she straightened a twisted drawstring. It was such a small, domestic gesture, something a lover would do without thinking. But coming from her, in that parking lot, under that dying light, it felt like a confession. Her hand lingered near my throat for a fraction of a second too long before she dropped it. We dragged that charged silence back into the ring the next day. We dragged that charged silence from the parking lot right through the ropes with us the next day. Usually, sparring is a calculated exercise. You agree on a pace, you work on specific combinations, you respect the hierarchy of the drill. But that Wednesday, the technicality evaporated the moment the bell rang. The air in the ring felt thin, brittle, like it would shatter if we moved too fast, yet we moved faster than we ever had. We weren't practicing anymore. We were having a kinetic argument about everything we hadn't said the night before. I came out aggressive, throwing a double jab that snapped the air in front of her face. I wanted to provoke a reaction. I wanted to see if the softness I'd seen by the truck was still there, or if the mechanic had put her armor back on. Harper didn't flinch. She slipped the first jab, parried the second, and moved inside my guard with a fluidity that made the hair on my arms stand up. She didn't counter immediately. She waited, letting the distance collapse until I could feel the heat of her breath against my neck, a ghost of a touch before she pivoted away. It became a conversation of bodies, a dialogue written in sweat and leverage. I would throw a hook, testing her perimeter. She would roll under it, testing my balance. Every impact felt heavier, loaded with a subtext that had nothing to do with boxing. When her glove connected with my ribs, it didn't feel like an attack. It felt like a check-in, a solid, grounding reminder that she was there, right there, occupying the same violent, beautiful space. We were reading each other like Braille, mapping the limits of what we could get away with. Then came the clinch. I had overcommitted on a right cross, throwing my weight too far forward, and Harper stepped in to jam the movement. We collided in the center of the ring, a tangle of limbs and leather. My chin hooked over her shoulder, her forehead pressed hard against my collarbone. Her arms wrapped around my waist to tie me up, locking us together. In any other session, the referee, or in our case, the timer, would be the signal to break. You hold for a second, you reset, you keep fighting. But the timer was silent and we didn't break. We stood there, chest to chest, hip to hip, fused together by the friction of the sport. The sound of the gym fell away. All I could hear was the ragged tear of her breathing and the thudding of my own heart against her chest. I could feel the dampness of her shirt soaking into mine, a mingling of sweat that felt obscenely intimate. It was a stolen moment. Outside, I couldn't just grab her without demanding an explanation. But here, in the ring, this was strategy. It was safe. I tightened my grip on her arms, pulling her closer under the guise of controlling her movement. I felt her resistance melt just for a second, her weight settling into me. She pulled back just enough to look at me. Her guard was up, gloves framing her face, but her eyes were wide open. There was no aggression in them. There was only a dark, hungry assessment. She wasn't looking at an opponent she needed to dismantle. She was looking at me the way she looked at those broken engines, like I was a complex, beautiful problem she was desperate to solve, but she was terrified of stripping the bolt. The bell rang, sharp and intrusive, shattering the moment. We broke apart, the sudden, cold air rushing into the space between us, feeling like a physical loss. The adrenaline was still spiking in my blood, a chemical cocktail of fight and desire that made my hands shake. I turned to head for my corner, to get water, to hide the flush on my face. But Harper didn't go to her corner. She cut across the ring, intercepting me before I could reach for my bottle, and pointed toward the bench. "Sit," she said, breath still hitching. "Let me check that wrap." It happened 3 nights later on a Friday. I was working the heavy bag, trying to bleed off a week's worth of frustration from a shipping error that had kept me on the loading dock until 8. My focus was fractured, my form sloppy. I was throwing punches with too much anger and not enough structure, relying on momentum rather than mechanics. I threw a left hook, intending to bury it in the side of the bag, but my spacing was off. I was half an inch too close. The impact didn't make the satisfying thud I was looking for. Instead, there was a sickening, muted crunch as my wrist buckled under the force of the blow. The pain was immediate and blinding, white-hot lightning shooting from my carpal bones straight up to my elbow. I gasped, a sharp, ragged sound that I tried to swallow, dropping my arm instantly to cradle it against my ribs. I turned away from the bag, biting the inside of my cheek to keep from swearing, trying to shake it off like it was just a stinger. But you can't hide a flinch from someone who's been watching you breathe for 6 months. Before I could even step back to reset my stance, the timer on the wall was silenced. I didn't see Harper move, but suddenly she was there, filling my field of vision. The casual, cool mechanic was gone. In her place was someone frantic, her professional mask shattered completely. She didn't ask if I was okay. She didn't wait for permission. She grabbed my forearm with a grip that was bordering on bruising, her eyes scanning my face with a terrifying intensity. "Let me see it," she demanded. Her voice wasn't the low, sultry rumble I was used to in the corner. It was sharp, pitched high with genuine panic. "Don't you dare pull away. Let me see it." She dragged me to the edge of the ring apron, pushing me down onto the canvas with a force that brooked no argument. Her hands, usually so steady when they worked on delicate engine valves or rewrapped my knuckles, were shaking. I watched, mesmerized through the haze of pain as her fingers fumbled with the laces of my glove. She wasn't stripping it with the slow, sensual deliberation of our usual ritual. She was tearing at it, desperate to get to the skin, terrified of what she might find underneath. When the glove finally peeled off, dropping to the floor with a dull thud, the air hit my wrist, and I hissed through my teeth. Harper froze. She took my hand in hers, cradling it as if it were made of spun glass. She began to palpate the joint, her thumbs pressing gently into the swelling that was already starting to bloom. She checked the range of motion, moving my fingers one by one, her focus absolute. "You're reckless," she muttered, but the anger in her tone was thin. A flimsy cover for something much softer and more frightened. "You throw your weight around like you don't have to live in this body tomorrow. You think you're made of steel, but you're not. You break just like the rest of us." "It's fine, Harper," I tried to say, though my voice wavered. "It's just a sprain." She stopped moving. She looked up at me, and the raw vulnerability in her expression knocked the wind out of me faster than a gut shot. Her eyes were dark, wide, and swimming with a fear that didn't match the situation. It was just a wrist. Fighters hurt their wrists all the time, but she wasn't looking at a fighter. "I need these hands to be okay," she whispered, the words tumbling out before she could catch them. She pressed her thumb into the center of my palm, grounding herself. I need you to be able to hold things. I just need them to be okay. The silence that followed was deafening. The gym noise, the skipping ropes, the heavy bags seemed to fade into a dull roar in the distance. All I could feel was the heat of her hand on mine and the throbbing ache in my wrist. That excuse, checking the tape, evaporated in the heat of her confession. This wasn't about safety protocols or technical critiques. This was terror. She was terrified of me being in pain. She was terrified of the fragility of the body she had spent months memorizing. I looked down at our hands, hers, grease-stained and rough, clutching mine, red and swelling. The contrast blurred. In that moment, I realized exactly how deep the water was. We weren't just sparring partners engaging in a harmless flirtation. She was invested in my survival. The realization was thrilling, sending a jolt of electricity through me that eclipsed the pain in my wrist, but it was also terrifying. Because once you admit that kind of care, there's no going back to just hitting pads. She didn't let go. Even after she had confirmed nothing was broken, even after the panic had subsided into a dull, aching relief, she kept my hand in hers. She sat there on the ring apron, head bowed over my palm, her thumb tracing the lifelines again and again, as if she could rewrite the injury away with touch alone. And I let her. I sat there, cradling the pain and the promise, knowing that everything had just shifted again. The tape was gone, the gloves were off, and we were running out of places to hide. It was a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the wrist incident, when the dynamic finally shifted from a slow simmer to a boil. The owner, a grumbling heavyweight relic named Sal, who smelled perpetually of cigar smoke and liniment, tossed the keys onto the canvas around 9:30. "Don't burn the place down," he muttered, pulling his collar up, against the rain that had been hammering the corrugated roof all evening. "Lock up when you're done, and kill the main breaker." When the heavy steel door clanged shut behind him, the silence that rushed in was absolute. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a library. It was the heavy, pressurized silence of a vault. I walked over to the breaker box and killed the main overheads. The gym plunged into a semi-darkness, illuminated only by the security lights. Pools of weak, blue-white sodium glare that turned the ring into a floating island in a sea of shadows. The familiar sounds of the gym, the rhythmic thud of the speed bag, the squeak of shoes, the bass-heavy hip-hop, were gone. All that was left was the hum of the refrigerator in the office and the sound of the rain drumming against the metal roof like 1,000 nervous fingers. We didn't leave. By all rights, we should have grabbed our bags and headed for the parking lot, maintaining the safety of our routine. But the gravity in the room had changed. We found ourselves sitting on the edge of the ring apron, legs dangling over the side, heels bumping softly against the wood paneling. The distance between us, usually measured in arm lengths or jab ranges, had collapsed. We were sitting thigh to thigh, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from her body through the damp cotton of her gym shorts. My hands were already unwrapped. The yellow gauze, usually the centerpiece of our nightly ritual, was rolled neatly and tucked away in my duffel bag. My knuckles were bare, the skin red and slightly raw from the heavy bag, but free. There was no tape to check. There was no loose thread to critique. There was no technical excuse left to justify the contact, and the air around us seemed to vibrate with the awareness of that fact. Harper shifted beside me, the canvas rustling under her weight. She didn't look at my face. Her gaze was fixed on my hands resting on my knees, staring at them with that same intense problem-solving focus she used when diagnosing a cracked manifold. Then, without a word, she reached out. This time, there was no hesitation. She didn't ask for permission, and she didn't offer a preamble about wrist support. She simply picked up my left hand and pulled it into her lap. The contact was shocking. Without the buffer of the sweat-soaked wrap or the leather glove, the sensation of her skin against mine was raw and immediate. Her hands were rough, the palms thickened by years of turning wrenches and handling hot metal, but they were incredibly warm. I could feel the ridges of her calluses against the back of my hand, a tactile map of her labor rubbing against mine. She turned my hand palm up, exposing the softest, most vulnerable part of me to the dim blue light. Her thumb began to trace the lines there, moving from the wrist up to the base of my fingers. It wasn't a massage to loosen a cramp. It was an exploration. "You know," she said, her voice barely a whisper, yet it seemed to echo in the empty warehouse. "In the shop, you can tell everything about an engine by the wear patterns, where the friction hits the hardest, where the heat builds up until the metal starts to warp." She pressed her thumb into the center of my palm, right where the skin was toughest. "People aren't that different. You carry all your tension right here, like you're always making a fist, even when your hand is open." I couldn't breathe. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I was sure she could feel the vibration through my arm. "Occupational hazard," I managed to choke out, the words feeling thick in my throat. I hold on tight. It's the only way to keep things from slipping. Harper stopped moving her thumb. She looked up then, her eyes catching the faint light from the security bank. They were dark, unreadable, and terrifyingly open. "Yeah," she murmured, the sound vibrating in the space between us. "I know. But you don't have to hold on to everything. Not in here." She shifted her grip, her fingers wrapping around my wrist, her thumb settling directly over my pulse point. It was racing, a frantic staccato rhythm that betrayed every secret I had ever tried to keep. She didn't pull away. She just held it, grounding me. The warmth of her grip seemed to seep into my bloodstream, dissolving the walls I'd spent a lifetime building. The rest of the gym, the heavy bags hanging like carcasses in the dark, the smell of bleach and old iron faded into a blur. There was only the heat of her hand, the rain on the roof, and the terrifying realization that the silence wasn't empty anymore. It was waiting. It was a loaded gun, waiting for one of us to pull the trigger. The question had been sitting in my throat for weeks, a jagged stone I couldn't swallow. It wasn't about the boxing anymore. It wasn't about mechanics or wrist support or the structural integrity of a metacarpal. It was about the way the air thinned every time she looked at me. It was about the terrifying hope that had started to bloom in the center of my chest, a weed growing through concrete. I looked at our hands, hers dark with grease stains, mine pale and shaking, and I knew I couldn't leave that ring without knowing. If I walked out that door tonight without asking, the silence would harden into a wall we'd never climb over. "Harper," I said. My voice sounded wrecked, stripped of the bravado I wore like armor during the day. "Why is the tape always loose?" The question hung in the damp air between us, simple and devastating. It was the only punch I'd ever thrown that I was afraid to land. Harper went still. Her thumb stopped its hypnotic circle on my wrist. For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound was the rain and the refrigerator humming in the dark. She didn't pull her hand away, but I felt the tension flood back into her frame, the familiar defensive posture of a fighter preparing for a blow. She looked down at the canvas, her jaw working, the muscles in her neck tight. The shadows played across her face, hiding her eyes, but I could see the struggle in the set of her shoulders. She was calculating the risk, running the diagnostics on what the truth would cost her. Then she exhaled. a long, shaky breath that seemed to deflate the tension in the room. She looked up, and for the first time since I'd known her, the guard was completely down. There was no calculation in her eyes, no assessment of angles or velocity. There was just a raw, terrifying honesty. "It never was," she said softly. The admission was quiet, barely louder than the rain, but it hit harder than a right hook. "The tape was never loose. I needed a reason." She paused, her fingers tightening slightly around my hand, grounding herself. "I spend all day fixing things that are broken. Metal, gears, things that don't feel anything. And then I come here, and I see you, pushing yourself until you're shaking, trying to carry the whole world on your shoulders." She swallowed hard, her gaze dropping to my palm again. "I just wanted to make sure you didn't break. I wanted 5 minutes where I could touch you without having to explain why. I wanted to be the one who takes care of the hands that do the fighting." It wasn't a dramatic speech. There were no violins, no grand declarations of undying love. It was a mechanic's confession, practical, grounded, and devastatingly real. She wasn't offering me the moon. She was offering me maintenance. She was telling me that she saw the wear and tear on my soul, and she wanted to be the one to grease the gears. The relief that washed over me was physical. It felt like the moment after a sparring session when the headgear comes off and the cool air hits your sweat-soaked face. The uncertainty that had been tightening my chest for months unspooled in an instant. I didn't pull away. I didn't laugh it off or try to deflect with a joke. I leaned in. The movement was slow, deliberate. I closed the scant inches between us until our knees were pressed together, a solid line of contact that anchored me to the earth. I turned my hand in hers, lacing our fingers together. It wasn't the way you hold a teammate's hand. It was a lock, a seal. "You don't need an excuse," I whispered. "Not anymore." Harper looked at me, her eyes searching my face for any sign of hesitation. When she found none, the tension finally left her shoulders. She leaned her forehead against mine, a gesture of intimacy that felt more profound than a kiss. We sat there, in the blue dark of the gym, the smell of rain and old leather wrapping around us, breathing the same air. The pretense was gone. The checking the tape charade lay on the floor with the discarded gloves. The connection was solid, real, and stronger than any defense I had ever put up in the ring. I realized then that the fighting had just been the language we used to get here. The discipline, the sparring, the sweat, it was all just the friction required to generate this heat. We weren't just two lonely people finding comfort in the dark. We were two fighters who had finally found the one thing worth dropping our hands for. The tape was never the point, and in the quiet of that empty gym, we both finally stopped pretending it was. It's been 6 weeks since the night the lights stayed off, and if you walked into the gym today, you might think nothing had changed. The air still tastes of iron and stale sweat, a thick, humid weight that settles in your lungs. Sal still screams at the heavyweights to stop dropping their guards. The rhythm of the speed bag still cuts through the bass-heavy hip-hop like a metronome, a constant reminder of the grind. But if you look closer, if you look at the corner where the shadows are longest, you'll see the shift. The tension that used to vibrate between us like a high-tension wire hasn't disappeared. It's just changed frequency. It's no longer a warning. It's a promise. We still spar. In fact, I think we fight harder now. There's a terrifying freedom in knowing that the person throwing the cross at your jaw is the same person who will ice it later. The hesitation is gone. We trade blows with a ferocity that scares the new guys, moving around the ring in a blur of violence and grace. We move like a single organism, a conversation of sweat and leverage that leaves us both gasping. Not from pain, but from the sheer electric charge of the contact. But now the dynamic is different. When we clinch, it's not just strategy to smother an attack. When her weight settles against mine, heavy and solid, there's a microsecond of recognition. The heat radiating off her chest isn't just body temperature, it's a signal. The eye contact through the headgear isn't searching for a weakness to exploit. It's a shared secret, a spark that says, I see you, I've got you. The ritual hasn't stopped either. Harper still wraps my hands before every session. It's become our liturgy, a necessary benediction before the violence begins. But the pretense of checking the tape is gone. She doesn't make excuses about loose threads or rolling wrists anymore. She just pulls me to the bench, sits me down, and takes my hands. The silence between us is comfortable now, filled with the easy, breathing intimacy of people who have seen each other at their limit. She winds the yellow gauze with that same surgical precision, layering the protection over my knuckles, securing the wrist with a mechanic's understanding of structure and stress. She smooths the tape over the back of my hand, her thumb tracing the tendons with a reverence that makes my breath hitch. But the end of the ritual has changed. Now, just before she pulls the Velcro tight, she pauses. The gym noise fades into the background. She brings my hand up to her mouth, her eyes never leaving mine, dark and unflinching. She presses a kiss to the taped knuckles. It's quick, a ghost of a touch, dry and warm against the rough cotton, but it hits me harder than any punch she's ever thrown. It's a seal. It's her way of blessing the weapons, of acknowledging the violence while promising the care that comes after. In a place built on aggression, that single moment of deliberate tenderness feels like a revolution. It's strange, finding softness in a place designed to make you hard. We spend our days in warehouses and garages, grinding our bodies down against concrete and steel, fighting for every inch of space we take up. We come here to hit things, to sharpen our edges until they can cut. But in the middle of all that impact, we found a safe place to be gentle. The discipline of the gym, the rules, the boundaries, the respect created the only structure strong enough to hold this kind of vulnerability without breaking it. We needed the armor to feel safe enough to take it off. Last night, the routine ended, but we didn't separate. We walked out of the heavy steel doors into the parking lot the same way we always do. The air was cold, biting at our damp skin, smelling of ozone and city rain. But this time, we didn't just lean against the trucks and talk about engines or quotas. Harper reached out and took my hand, my sore, tired, battered hand, and laced her grease-stained fingers through mine. The calluses on her palm scraped against mine, a friction that felt like home. We walked to her truck like that, linked together against the dark, illuminated by that flickering sodium streetlight. I looked at our hands, the knuckles swollen, the skin rough, and I realized we had finally won. We found the only fight worth losing, the one against our own feelings. We started as two bodies protecting our center lines, terrified of letting anything in. We ended up with open palms, finding that the strongest grip isn't a fist, but a hand holding on. The tape was never about the wrist, it was about the tether. If you've ever found tenderness in the toughest places, subscribe to hear more stories about the fight for connection. The bell rang, but the round never really ended.